Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. When it comes to the idea that SARS-CoV-2 leaked from a lab, there hasn't been any new evidence to support that idea since pretty much early 2020, and there was practically no evidence to begin with. Meanwhile, more and more evidence has piled up demonstrating that yes, SARS-CoV-2 did emerge as a zoonotic spillover. But that hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists, and it hasn't stopped them from being loud enough to get an audience with US lawmakers. This is embarrassing and worrying, so I figured I was going to talk about it today. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Dr. Robert Redfield, who is the former CDC director, and his testimony that he gave to US Congress just recently. He made a lot of false claims, and in my opinion, represented just how empty the lab leak idea really is. So let's jump right into it and hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much. I think just to emphasize, in early to mid-January, I did have multiple calls with Fauci, Farrar, and Tedros about how important I thought it was that science get engaged in aggressively pursuing both hypotheses.
That's exactly what the scientific community did. They examined the evidence and determined which idea was most strongly supported by the evidence. That conversation is borne out in the scientific literature. You can literally watch it evolve from the beginning of the pandemic to where we are now. And I'll go over some of that in this video. But that's just the first point I want to highlight, is that Robert Redfield and others seem to have this idea that the lab leak idea was just immediately discounted by everybody. And that's not true. They even point that out themselves by looking at emails shared by certain scientists that they'll talk about later. These ideas were acknowledged as possibilities and actively investigated. They were just found to not be very strongly supported.
I also expressed, as a clinical virologist, that I felt it was not scientifically plausible that this virus went from a bat to humans and became one of the most infectious viruses that we have for humans.
This is a very bizarre straw man that I would expect from a random, uneducated lab leaker online, and not from a former CDC director. SARS-CoV-2 is not claimed to have come directly from bats into humans. It is widely believed that SARS-CoV-2 spent time in an intermediary host before transitioning to humans. It was not ever suggested that it came directly from bats into humans. The genome of SARS-CoV-2 made experts suspect that this was the case with SARS-CoV-2 as well, that it spent time in an intermediary host before transitioning to humans, so not directly from bats to humans. Furthermore, we know that when SARS-CoV-2 did make the jump to humans, it was not so-called perfectly adapted to be as infectious as it is today in humans. It did undergo evolution in order to optimize itself to transitioning from human to human. For the sake of the length of this video, I'm glossing over a lot of details here, but if you want to read more about this, I'm including all of the links in the description of this video for you to do so. Just know that these are relatively basic facts that a former CDC director and head of the coronavirus task force should know if he's going to go in front of Congress to give testimony on this topic. So the fact that he doesn't know this or just doesn't say it is worrying.
In emails following the conference call, 4 of the 11 scientists told Fauci that they all found the genetic sequence inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, basically what you're saying. However, just 3 days later, these 4 scientists had drafted a paper arguing the exact opposite, and that's now the infamous proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Our investigations show that this paper was prompted by Dr. Fauci, among others, with a goal to disprove the lab leak theory.
This is a misrepresentation of events that lab leak proponents constantly bring up. They just won't shut up about these emails that they love to cherry pick and misinterpret. If you read the emails and actually listen to the people who wrote those emails in later interviews, it's all perfectly explained. They initially looked at the SARS-CoV-2 genome and saw things that confused them. So they thought, maybe this is a lab leak. Let's get together as colleagues, as a community of scientists, and talk about it. That was what that email chain was initially about. In fact, in those emails, you can see Fauci showing a lot of urgency about this idea, saying, hey, if you guys get together and talk about this and agree with each other that this might really be a lab leak, then he is going to notify the US government right away and start taking action. But what happened was they all got together and they started talking about the ideas that made them suspicious that it was a lab leak. And they came to the conclusion that no, it's actually not that suspicious. This is what scientists do. They get together, they discuss ideas, and they try to tear each other's ideas down, no matter what the idea is. If you come to a lab meeting and propose an idea, they are going to ask you questions to tear down your idea. And if you can defend your idea with data and evidence and reasoning, then your idea might be able to stand and you can convince the room. However, if your idea is weak and not supported by the evidence, it'll get torn down. Scientists will readily change their minds to reflect the data, and that will be that. And that's exactly what happened here. Some people came into that meeting thinking that it looks maybe engineered or it looks like a lab leak. And by the end of that conversation, with lots of experts getting together and scrutinizing the data in a group as a community, then that idea was tossed out. All of this is actually reflected in that proximal origins paper. It brings up all of these ideas that initially might suggest a lab leak and explains why they think the evidence points away from a lab leak. And just to be clear, they did not write and publish this paper in just a few days. They had their meeting in the beginning of February 2020, and the paper was published in Nature March 17th of 2020. And no, this is not a peer-reviewed Nature paper, it's a correspondence. It's a brief letter to the editor on a topical issue. There is absolutely nothing nefarious in those emails or the timeline with writing that proximal origins paper. It is just scientists proposing ideas, arguing with each other, and letting the best idea stand at the end of the day. So surely Robert Redfield is going to disagree with that statement that that congresswoman just made, right?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Again, I've said this before, that this whole approach that was taken on February 1st and subsequently in the month of February, if you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science.
Thank you.
Science has debate, and they squashed any debate.
Of course not. This idea that just because scientists don't get on a stage to argue with each other in front of a live audience doesn't mean that their scientific debate is just ridiculous. There is always scientific debate happening in the scientific community all the time. It's happening in lab meetings, it's happening in departmental seminars, at conferences, in the literature that scientists write, by the water coolers, at the bars. Scientists are always discussing ideas with each other and trying to figure out what the evidence actually tells them and how to push the boundaries of science. That's what the scientific community does, and just because you don't see that every day doesn't mean it's not happening. Indeed, it's much easier for the media to put on stage a controversial, edgy, and flashy topic rather than expose you to a bunch of nerds using jargon arguing with each other about what their latest experiments show.
Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September.
That's a common claim that I hear from lab leak proponents, but despite lots of searching and lots of study, there is just no evidence that there were infections that were widespread back in September. As far as we can tell, the best answer that genetic and epidemiological data can give us, the first SARS-CoV-2 case or spillover event likely happened around November 18th, 2019, with a range of October 23rd to December 8th of that same year. There has so far been no evidence to dispute this, despite lots of searching in blood bank data and epidemiological records. There is just no evidence to suggest otherwise. So I don't know why Robert Redfield is suggesting this. It's certainly not an evidence-based claim.
Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
The discourse around gain of function when it comes to the general public and this political situation is so deep in a cesspit that I think the best thing I can do is point you, the viewers, toward this article here. Virology Under the Microscope, A Call for Rational Discourse, written by several virologists. And instead of just highlighting this paragraph for you to read yourself, I'm going to read it off because I think it's that important. This paragraph follows a table in which there is a long list of gain-of-function experiments that actually led to really important and impactful findings that either greatly enhanced our understanding when it comes to certain pathogens or directly led to production of life-saving antivirals or vaccines for specific pathogens. And this paragraph reads, despite these clear benefits, a narrative has developed suggesting that gain-of-function research is synonymous with high risk or nefarious activity to engineer or enhance pandemic pathogens. In truth, gain-of-function research is a valuable experimental approach that virologists use to address essential questions. Virologists do not take their work lightly and thoughtfully propose experiments to address essential questions. Virologists do not operate in isolation to judge the risks of experiments. Layers of regulation are in place such that risks are considered by individuals with diverse perspectives and expertise. The vast majority of virology experiments could not enhance pandemic potential, referred to in the United States as gain-of-function research of concern. Those rare experiments that could are currently subject to stringent oversight through the U.S. government under programs known as dual-use research of concern and potential pandemic pathogens care and oversight, and also by the vast majority of international publishers, including the American Society for Microbiology and the Public Library of Science. There are clearly experiments where the risks outweigh the benefits, and it is important that mechanisms exist to prevent such experiments. However, in many cases, gain-of-function research of concern can very clearly advance pandemic preparedness and the development of vaccines and antivirals. These tangible benefits often far outweigh the theoretical risks posed by modified viruses. Thus, it is important that oversight mechanisms faithfully consider both risks and benefits of these types of studies. It is equally important that the mechanisms used to provide oversight of gain-of-function research of concern be focused on research that is indeed of concern. Identifying research of concern is complex, but it is critical that safeguards be both thoughtfully designed and implemented to avoid suppressing innovation in a field essential to mitigating infectious disease threats and with the potential to transform health. If you are someone who is concerned about gain-of-function research, I highly recommend you go read that entire article and start to learn a bit about what is and is not gain-of-function research. In the case of what they're talking about in that video, no, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was not being funded by the NIH to perform gain-of-function research. They were being funded to perform characterization research. They were being funded to go out in the field, collect coronaviruses from wild bats, take those samples back to the lab, and characterize those coronaviruses, not by growing the coronaviruses themselves, but by taking their genomes and studying the genomes. If you do not understand the process of how they did this, or why it is really important for us to do, then you should not be someone loudly voicing your opposition to gain-of-function research.
Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, who told us it came from a lab and emails to Dr. Fauci that Dr. Fauci wouldn't let Dr. Redfield see. 3 days later, they changed their position 180 degrees. The question is why?
It's not exactly a mystery. Like I said, the experts got together, debated their ideas, and decided which idea was most supported by the evidence. And real quick, I just want to address this email from Christian Anderson here that lab leakers tend to get a bee in their bonnet about. They like to quote this part where Christian says that their focus will be on disproving the lab leak hypothesis, but I want you all to understand that this is the intent with any hypothesis. Scientists create hypotheses in order to disprove them. All experiments are designed to disprove a scientist's hypothesis. That's what he means here. If they can't disprove it, then they will accept it. But they ended up disproving it. So there you go. But that's not what this panel thinks. They prefer to go the conspiracy route.
Two of the signatories of the original email to Dr. Fauci, that's Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, were awarded a $9 million grant for the...
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. I knew you'd get to it. I read that last night.
Yep, that's the route they're going here. They say that these scientists just changed their mind for money because they wanted to please Fauci. It's such a nothing idea that it's wild that Congress is wasting taxpayer dollars hearing them and believing them and pursuing them. This is not how grants work. Fauci doesn't just sign off on an NIH grant and boom, you got it. No, grants are written and submitted and then anonymously peer-reviewed by a panel of NIH grant reviewers who are experts in certain fields. These review committees then give scores to each grant and decide which grants actually get funding. The important decisions regarding this particular grant were made before those meetings were even had. So, no, there's no evidence that these scientists changed their mind for money. But that's really all that this lab leak idea has. It's not even really a theory, it's just an idea that has no evidence. They constantly talk about and impose imaginary motivations onto emails and meetings, rather than look for direct evidence that SARS-CoV-2 actually came from a lab. Unfortunately, widespread belief of this idea not only contributes to a de-education of the American public when it comes to topics like zoonotic spillover and virology research, but it also is creating unnecessary and unfortunate political tensions, which ultimately have gotten in the way of uncovering better evidence when it comes to the origins of SARS-CoV-2. Finally, zoonotic spillover is a real and very big threat to humanity, and believing that this virus came from a lab kind of puts aside the solutions to mitigating those risks moving forward. There is a long history of zoonotic spillover, of animals passing infectious diseases onto humans, and it has had devastating consequences for society in the past, and continues to this day. The details of this history and the rabbit hole that is the SARS-CoV-2 origins debate run very deep, so this video is not going to be comprehensive in covering all those issues, but I am providing a lot of links in the description of interviews with scientists and papers and just general helpful resources to help you understand this topic and explore it more if you so wish. So I'll just end this video with what, in my opinion, would be the most important thing that a lab leak proponent would have to address, and that is the fact that SARS-CoV-2 emerged in a live animal market. In a city of 11 million people, if a virus were to leak from a lab, how would it emerge in the exact place that we would expect to find it if it were a zoonotic spillover? Why not an office building? Why not a church? Why not a school? Why not any of the places that have much more foot traffic than a market? A market where we know that animals that are known to carry coronaviruses were sold live. This is a market where these animals were often butchered in front of their customers before they bought them. And at regular intervals throughout the day, the remains and innards of those animals were washed down drains with high-powered hoses, aerosolizing lots of bodily fluids that came from those animals. So did that environment, which has all the perfect ingredients to cause a zoonotic spillover, or did it leak from a lab and happen to end up there? Also, while editing this video, some new information came out about a story that recently broke in the Atlantic. Unfortunately, before the Huanan Seafood Market closed down, there were no swabs taken from live animals. Instead, all the animals were culled and disposed of right away in order to try and squash any outbreak that might be occurring as fast as possible. The Chinese government absolutely did not want a new SARS outbreak on their hands and associated with an $80 billion exotic meat trade market. But anyway, there were samples taken from environmental sources, stalls and drains where animal guts were washed down at the end of the day, were all swabbed, and some of them came back positive for SARS-CoV-2. And within those swab samples, there exists other DNA, other genetic sources that can tell you where the sample actually came from. The kinds of experiments being done to determine what those genetic sources are is called metagenomics. So you can take a sample, you can find SARS-CoV-2 in it, and you can also look to see if you can find DNA from other organisms in it. If you find DNA from just one organism along with the SARS-CoV-2 genome, then you can be reasonably confident in saying that this sample came from the other genetic source. For example, if it was SARS-CoV-2 mixed with human DNA, then you could assume that that sample came from a human. But if it came from another animal, you would expect it to be SARS-CoV-2 mixed with that animal's DNA. And apparently, according to preliminary data, there were several samples at the Huanan Seafood Market that were both positive for SARS-CoV-2 and a species of animal that was sold live at the market illegally and is known to carry coronaviruses. This is just another piece of evidence demonstrating that there were animals carrying SARS-CoV-2 at the Huanan Seafood Market where the outbreak started. It is just yet another nail in the lab leak coffin. But we will wait until the paper is peer-reviewed and published before we say anything more definitive about those data. Unless some big new evidence comes out, the answer is always going to be clear. SARS-CoV-2 is a zoonotic origin spillover. It should teach us that we need to take bigger steps to prevent these kinds of spillovers in the future, not point fingers at scientists who do the work to prepare us for exactly these pandemics. Well, that's going to do it for this week's video. It's a shame to see Robert Redfield saying such blatantly wrong things, but here we are. Anyway, all of the links to all of the science that I talked about in this video and much, much more are linked in the description below. So please do check them out if you are more interested in this topic and want to learn more about it. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you like this video, then don't forget to give it a like and subscribe so that you can catch me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.